Hey everyone, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire universe. I've just finished the main series of books, although I haven't gotten into the supplementary material, the in-universe history books or the Dunk and Egg short stories yet. But I'm read up enough that I think I have some stuff I could contribute to the community. And if you're not part of that community, if you're not a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, my theory is still based more so on real-world ancient and medieval history than it is necessarily based on in-universe histories and chronologies. So if you're not a fan, I still think, if you like my regular content, you'll still probably enjoy this, as it is talking a lot about medieval history. And specifically when it comes to medieval history, the topic that I'm going to be focusing on is how medieval people, and sort of what we might think of ancient people more broadly, thought of history. Like, how did they conceptualize history? And the answer is they kind of didn't. They have what I might call, or what I'm going to call, and what other people hopefully might call, a sort of perpetual present. Which is to say, they sort of thought that the world they knew, the medieval world, or their particular slice of the ancient world, basically the current year was sort of the way things had always been done. So what exactly do I mean by this? Well, simply put, when they imagined the past, they didn't think of these big changes that would happen between sort of different stages of the past, like we think of. So for instance, if you take the Bible, which is something that was sort of widely produced throughout the Middle Ages, and you look at the pictures of the Bible, they look fairly contemporary to whatever stage of the medieval period they're being produced at. Warriors like Goliath and King David are shown not as we imagine sort of ancient Israelite or ancient Middle Eastern warriors, but are portrayed as contemporary medieval knights. And this is something we see outside of the Bible as well if we look at sort of other texts that are theoretically reflecting the ancient past, which is something that actually happens quite a lot in medieval literature, is stages of the past. So for instance, you have 14th century bards talking about, 4th century King Arthur, or what we think of as being sort of in that late Roman period, but he's always reflected as holding court in a fancy castle, wearing plate mail, following a code of chivalry, all of the stuff that reflected their contemporary culture, and not something that would have been culturally relevant to somebody living in the early Middle Ages. And we can see this with other figures. So, for instance, Charlemagne was another historical figure that appeared quite frequently in medieval traditions. And again, he's portrayed not as this early medieval king, but as a contemporary king to whenever the story is being written. And even when they talk about things like, when they set a story in ancient Greece or in ancient Rome, there's still knights who fight in tournaments, not sort of as we would conceptualize a ancient warrior. And this is something that appears again and again and again, is just sort of they imagine sort of whatever time period they live in is the natural way the world works. And even when they do have better conceptualizations of the past, they're aware of sort of big, broad changes. For instance, the Roman Empire. They knew there was a Roman Empire, and a lot of sort of medieval kingdoms were trying to echo a Roman past because they saw that as this glorious past. But when they talk about the Roman Empire, it's still thought of in medieval terms. So for instance, if you look at some of the early Arthurian traditions, where King Arthur goes to the continent and fights the Roman Empire, it's noted that like the Roman Empire under him has, the king of Africa, the king of France, the king of Greece, all of these kings that are coming with him to go fight King Arthur. which again, they're not conceptualizing it like we do, where you have this singular entity, the Roman Empire, but instead the Emperor of Rome is seen as a medieval overking with a bunch of vassal kingdoms under him. They're not picturing things in the way that we do. It's very much just a medieval world with a thin veneer of Romanitas sprinkled onto it. They pictured their world as being essentially constant in the way that it was. Which is something that makes perfect sense when you look at their worldview. Because of course these people, whether they be ancient or medieval, generally thought of the world as the way we would consider a creationist. And in the case of sort of medieval Europe, you have that quite literally with the biblical creation that we think of when we think of creationists. But even when you look at sort of other cultures' ideas of how the world was formed, it's generally that same idea that the world sort of was created and then existed relatively constantly. So, like in the Bible, you have the creation of cities and metalworking and all of that is pretty much within a generation of creation. It happens, agriculture happens as soon as they're kicked out of the garden. There's not this slow buildup of a Stone Age and a Bronze Age and an Iron Age. And in fact, that three-age system comes up surprisingly late in academic thought. Like the idea that people had always been working iron and steel since, they were divinely created was the standard mode of thought for most of human history. Which again just feeds into this idea that no, our current social order, our current society was constant. They didn't really have a strong idea of social change in quite the way we do. They sort of would imagine the past as being slightly different. We used to be pagans, the Normans hadn't invaded yet, whatever it is. But it was still more or less, society was the same as society was in their day. So I started this video by saying that I was tying this into A Song of Ice and Fire. So what does this have to do with this fantasy book series? So in the fan community, particularly when you have a lot of fan theories, something that I've seen a few times is this idea that the world of A Song of Ice and Fire has been stuck in the Middle Ages for thousands of years. That they hadn't been making progress. Everything is sort of laid out, and it's been the Middle Ages for, again, thousands of years, sometimes hundreds of years. Just that they've been stuck in the Dark Ages, or what we might call the Dark Ages, for entirely too long. They should be making technological developments, and they aren't. And needs to be some sort of explanation for this. Why aren't they developing? Is there a conspiracy of the maesters to put down scientific advancements or something like this? And I just don't think that there's a good enough evidence to say there hasn't been progress. Because if we imagine them being like medieval people, which I think our author wants us to do, then they wouldn't conceptualize the world being different. And this is even something that's explicitly brought up in the text. A lot of times Sam and the other sort of learned characters mention the fact that the history is very unreliable. That we have histories that stretch back before we should have written histories. And they talk about Kingsguards before Kingsguard showed up. Or knights before there was the Faith of the Seven, which in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe, knights are implicitly tied to this religion of the Faith of the Seven. So they're very much aware in universe that the histories are unreliable in a way that I think fits with the way a medieval person in our world would have understood their history. That they're imagining it as an everlasting present, that the past is just more of the same. That there were Kingsguard because we have Kingsguard, so of course they would have had Kingsguard in the past. Of course this and that. So this is something that I think we need to consider is there really these big changes? Is there really a lack of change, or is it just that the society that's being presented, this medieval style society in Westeros and Essos and the other places we visit, Is it really that they haven't developed in 2,000 years? Or is it just that they are in a stage of academic development where they would picture the past as largely the same? They're really just starting to shake that off with things like the Meisters and Sam pointing out that these histories don't make sense. And I think this also has implications for not just sort of that world building of, that there's things we aren't seeing, like technological development over the centuries, but even with sort of specific questions that have been raised that might bring further speculation. So, for instance, in the myth of the Long Night, which is sort of, there's, for those of you who again aren't fans of A Song of Ice and Fire, there was a long night, the others, or the White Walkers in the show, come and invade, and there's a mythical hero that has to go fight them off. And there's a problem where he has to go and find the children of the forest, which are sort of the equivalent of elves, is sort of the best way to put it. But they're missing. And according to traditional Westerosi history, the children of the forest aren't really pushed out of the kingdom until a later period, when the Andals invade. So there is this thing of why are the children of the forest missing? They should be there. And I think, again, this goes back to if we look at how medieval people conceptualized the past in their stories, in the sagas and the romances. It was, again, something very similar to the way society worked in their day, not necessarily the way that the past would have been conceived. So, for instance, if we look, in Ireland, there's the myths of Finn McCool, who is supposedly in the pre-Christian past, but he fights Norsemen in Dublin, something that shouldn't be in the pre-Christian past. They don't really show up until much later in the medieval period. Well, it's just because the audience expected there to be Vikings because there were Vikings there in their day. So I think it's sort of the same thing in reverse, where even if during the actual time of the typical long night, the children of the forest would have been there, a modern Westerosi audience probably isn't thinking about that in the same way that, the Maesters or the fans who are going over the details are. The children of the forest are hard to find, therefore, when, the hero is looking for children of the forest during the long night, the children of the forest should be hard to find, because that's how the children of the forest are, so obviously that's how it's always been. So I don't really have a theory on my own. I don't have anything to present, but I do think this is a detail that has been overlooked by some of these theories that take things like the lack of development or the missing children of the forest or all these other historical details a bit too seriously, whereas I think we have reason, even in the text, to accept that as just the histories aren't correct and the legends aren't literally true. And I just think that's something that a lot of theorists have been overlooking. So that's my 2 cents, and I would love to hear your all opinions on this. Thank you.